You know that moment when you open your laptop just for a second, and suddenly you're watching a video about how medieval blacksmiths cooled swords in goat urine, and you sit there thinking, how did I even get here? Yeah, that wasn't curiosity. That was avoidance wearing a disguise. And maybe it's not even videos. Maybe it's cleaning your room instead of starting that assignment, or replying to messages you suddenly remembered you needed to answer, or staring at your to-do list like it personally insulted you. You don't hate the task, you just can't seem to begin it. Here's the strange part. Most procrastination doesn't come from laziness. It comes from resistance, a psychological wall that feels way bigger than the actual task in front of you. And there's a simple trick people swear by. It sounds almost insultingly simple, the kind of advice you'd dismiss immediately. The 5-minute rule. Do it for 5 minutes, that's it. Not finish it. Not master it. Not even do it well. Just start for 5 minutes. And yet, something strange happens in those 5 minutes. And understanding why might say more about your brain than your calendar ever will. Because procrastination isn't one thing. It shows up in different personalities, different mental loops, different emotional traps. And once you see your pattern, the 5-minute rule stops being a trick and starts becoming a kind of psychological leverage. Then there's the avoider. You know this one. They open the document, stare at the blinking cursor, feel a slight tightening in their chest, and suddenly decide it's the perfect time to reorganize their entire desktop. Icons everywhere. New folders. Color coding. Anything but the actual task. For the avoider, the problem isn't time. It's emotional discomfort. The task carries a vague weight. Uncertainty, boredom, maybe even fear of not doing it right. So the brain does something clever. It swaps discomfort for control. Organizing a folder feels safe. Starting the task feels like stepping into fog. The 5-minute rule works here because it removes the forever feeling. Your brain isn't being asked to commit to the mountain. Only the first step, just 5 minutes in the fog. And often, once you're in it, the fog isn't as thick as you imagined. You don't need courage for the whole journey. Just enough for the first stretch. But then, there's the overthinker. This is the person who doesn't avoid the task. They mentally complete it 10 times before even starting once. They plan, refine, restructure, optimize. They're not procrastinating. They're preparing. At least, that's what it feels like. But under the surface, something else is happening. Perfectionism dressed up as productivity. If you think long enough, you can avoid the risk of doing it imperfectly, because once it's real, it can be judged. And judgment is uncomfortable. For the overthinker, the 5-minute rule interrupts the illusion of preparation. You don't plan for 5 minutes. You do. Badly, if necessary. Awkwardly. Messily. The point is to break the spell of thinking as a substitute for action, because action, even imperfect action, recalibrates reality faster than any mental rehearsal ever could. Then there's the dopamine chaser. You've met them too. They sit down to work, and within seconds their brain whispers, just a quick check. Social media. Messages. News. Another tab. Another scroll. Another hit. It's not lack of discipline. It's a brain tuned to instant reward in a world that keeps handing it out like candy. Deep work feels slow. Life feels fast. Guess which one wins? For this type, 5 minutes works like a reset button. You're not promising focus for an hour. You're just saying stay here long enough for your brain to realize it won't die from boredom. 5 minutes of resistance creates a tiny gap. And in that gap, the urge loses some of its power. Not all. Just enough to notice it instead of obey it. And then something interesting happens. The brain, once deprived of its usual quick reward loop, starts adapting, not instantly, but enough to shift direction. But here's the twist. There's also the burnout procrastinator. This one is quieter. They're not scrolling endlessly or avoiding dramatically. They're just tired. Not the kind of tired that sleep fixes, but the kind that builds slowly. Decisions feel heavier. Tasks feel bigger than they used to. Even starting feels like pushing a door that keeps swinging back. For them, procrastination isn't avoidance of work. It's avoidance of depletion. The 5-minute rule here becomes almost deceptive in its gentleness. You're not forcing productivity. You're just borrowing momentum. 5 minutes of light engagement, not pressure, not performance, just contact with the task. Often that's enough to reduce the psychological weight. Not because the task changed, but because your nervous system realized it wasn't under attack. And maybe there's another layer most people miss. Because beneath all of this, there's something called task inertia. Your mind treats starting as the hardest form of resistance, not continuing, not finishing, just the initial push from 0 to 1. That's where the friction lives. And once you cross that line, even clumsily, your brain starts to reclassify the experience. It stops labeling it as future threat and starts treating it as current activity. That shift alone reduces the emotional weight of the task more than most people realize. There's also a subtle psychological loop at play, the Zeigarnik effect. Your mind actually dislikes unfinished things, so once you start, even for a few minutes, it begins holding the task open in the background. Not as something to avoid anymore, but as something that wants completion. That's why stopping after 5 minutes often feels harder than starting. The brain, once engaged, doesn't fully let go. It keeps a small thread attached, quietly nudging you back. And maybe that's the real illusion of procrastination. It feels like you're resisting the task, when in reality, you're just resisting the first tiny moment of contact with it. There's also something even more subtle happening under the surface: emotional forecasting errors. Your brain is surprisingly bad at predicting how you will feel once you actually begin. It exaggerates discomfort before starting, but once you're in motion, the emotional intensity usually drops by half or more. The task itself doesn't change. Your prediction of it does, which is why 5 minutes works almost like a correction tool. It replaces prediction with experience. And experience almost always wins. There's a reason people say, "I'll just do 5 minutes," and then look up an hour later wondering what happened. It's not magic. It's momentum. And momentum doesn't care about motivation. It only cares that something is already in motion. And maybe that's the real secret. You don't need to feel ready. You don't need the perfect plan. You don't need the mood, the inspiration, or the alignment of cosmic productivity energy. You just need 5 minutes of willingness to begin badly. So here's the question that matters more than the technique itself. Which version of you shows up when things need to get done? The avoider, the overthinker, the dopamine chaser, the burnout thinker, or some mix that changes depending on the day? And more importantly, what happens if next time, instead of negotiating with your entire future, you just say, 5 minutes, that's all? Because sometimes the difference between stuck and started isn't motivation. It's permission to begin before you feel ready.